No one in the restaurant dared look directly at her. One furrowed brow from her, and the manager sweated through his collar. The head chef froze mid-motion. Staff braced for immediate termination. Victoria Hale, the millionaire known for her ruthlessness, was having lunch like any other day. Then a poor waiter, a single dad, did what no one else would dare. No shouting, no resistance, just one calm action that made the woman the entire room feared stop cold. What did he do? The lunch rush at Meridian had barely started when Victoria Hale walked through the door. The hostess saw her first, and her smile faltered for half a second before snapping back into place. She didn't need to check the reservation list. Victoria Hale never made reservations. She arrived, and a table appeared. The restaurant occupied the top floor of a glass tower in the financial district, the kind of place where a salad cost $40, and the waitstaff spoke in hushed, reverent tones. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp shadows across white tablecloths and polished silverware. The clientele consisted mostly of executives sealing deals over wine that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. Victoria moved through the space like she owned it. In a way, she did. Her investment firm had funded the building's construction 5 years ago, and everyone who worked here knew it. She was 52 but looked younger, her dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested efficiency rather than vanity. Her suit was charcoal gray, tailored to precision, and she wore no jewelry except a watch that cost as much as a decent car. The manager, a thin man named Robert with graying hair and perpetually worried eyes, materialized at her elbow before she'd taken 3 steps inside. He'd been managing Meridian for 8 years and had learned to read the room with the instinct of someone whose livelihood depended on it. Victoria Hale was not a difficult customer in the conventional sense. She never raised her voice, she never made scenes. But her displeasure had a way of reshaping careers. "Ms. Hale, your usual table is ready," Robert said, gesturing toward the corner booth with the best view of the city skyline. His voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had perfected the art of professional anxiety. Victoria didn't acknowledge him. She simply walked in the direction he'd indicated, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed to dictate the pace of everyone around her. 2 waiters stepped aside. A busboy nearly dropped a tray trying to get out of her path. By the time she reached her table, the entire staff had recalibrated their movements around her presence. In the kitchen, Ethan Cole was refilling water pitchers when he heard Robert's voice come through the service door, tight with tension. "She's here. Table 12. Mark's sick, so Ethan, you're taking it." Ethan looked up from the pitcher. He was 38, tall but not imposing, with the kind of face that people forgot easily. His dark hair was starting to gray at the temples, and his hands had the roughness of someone who'd worked service jobs most of his adult life. He'd been at Meridian for 2 years, long enough to know what Table 12 meant. "Understood," he said, setting down the pitcher and straightening his apron. Around him, the other servers exchanged glances. Nobody wanted Victoria Hale's table. Mark, who usually handled it, had called in sick that morning with what sounded like genuine relief in his voice. Ethan didn't blame him. He picked up a menu and a wine list, checked his appearance in the reflection of a steel cabinet, and pushed through the service door into the dining room. The ambient noise of conversation and clinking glasses washed over him. But as he approached Table 12, he noticed how the volume seemed to drop in the surrounding area. People were eating, talking, conducting business, but there was a buffer of careful silence around Victoria Hale's booth. She was already seated, her phone on the table, her attention fixed on something in the middle distance. Ethan approached from her left, the way Robert had trained all of them to do, and stopped at a respectful distance. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hale," he said, his voice even and professional. "My name is Ethan. I'll be taking care of you today." Victoria's eyes shifted to him. They were dark, calculating, the eyes of someone who had made a fortune by noticing things other people missed. She looked him up and down in a way that felt less like assessment and more like inventory. "Where's Mark?" she asked. Her voice was cold, precise, the kind of voice that didn't waste syllables. "Mark called in sick this morning," Ethan replied. "I'll be happy to assist you with anything you need." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Displeasure, maybe. Or just the reflexive irritation of someone whose routine had been disrupted. She picked up the menu without responding, and Ethan took that as his cue to recite the specials. He kept it brief. Victoria Hale didn't need descriptions. She interrupted him halfway through the second special, her voice cutting through his words like a knife through paper. "The lighting is different," she said, not looking up from the menu. Ethan glanced at the overhead fixtures. They looked the same as always. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hale. Different how?" "Brighter. It was softer last week." He didn't argue. There was no point. "I'll speak to the manager about adjusting it for you." "Don't speak to him. Fix it." She closed the menu and set it down with a precision that suggested everything she did was deliberate. "I'll have the salmon. No butter. Steamed vegetables. No seasoning. Sparkling water. No ice." Ethan wrote it down, though he didn't need to. Her order never changed. "Absolutely. I'll have that right out for you." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "The table is uneven." Ethan looked down. The table appeared level. No wobble, no tilt. But he nodded. "I'll take care of it immediately." In the kitchen, he relayed the order to the line cook, a broad-shouldered man named Carlos, who'd worked at Meridian since it opened. Carlos glanced at the ticket and shook his head. "She's in a mood today, huh?" Carlos said, already prepping the salmon. "Same as always," Ethan replied. He grabbed a stack of table shims from the supply closet and headed back into the dining room. When he reached table 12, Victoria was on her phone, her fingers moving across the screen with the rapid efficiency of someone who managed empires from anywhere. Ethan knelt beside the table, lifted one corner slightly, and slid a shim beneath the leg. He tested it, removed the shim, tried a thinner one. Victoria didn't look at him, but he could feel her awareness of his presence, the way a predator tracks movement in its peripheral vision. When he finished, he stood and stepped back. "That should be more stable, Ms. Hale." She set her phone down and placed both hands flat on the table, pressing down as if testing the structural integrity of the building itself. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she looked up at him. "It's still uneven," she said. Ethan crouched again, adjusted the shim, stood, waited. Victoria pressed the table again. This time, she didn't say anything, which Ethan interpreted as reluctant acceptance. He returned to the kitchen, checked on her order, and brought out her sparkling water in a glass so clean it looked like it had been laser cut from ice. She took a sip and set it down. "This is tap water." It wasn't. Ethan knew it wasn't because he'd opened the bottle himself 30 seconds ago, but he didn't argue. "I'll bring you a fresh glass immediately, Ms. Hale." He returned to the kitchen, poured from the same bottle into a new glass, and brought it back. Victoria took another sip. This time, she said nothing. Progress, Ethan thought, though he knew better than to relax. The meal had only just begun. The salmon arrived 12 minutes later, plated with the kind of precision that suggested someone in the kitchen understood exactly what was at stake. Ethan carried it from the kitchen with both hands, moving through the dining room with the careful balance of someone who'd done this thousands of times. He set the plate in front of Victoria without a sound, the porcelain meeting the tablecloth with barely a whisper. She looked down at it. Her fork remained on the table. Ethan waited, standing at the prescribed distance, hands folded in front of him. Around them, the restaurant continued its careful choreography of wealth and discretion, but the tables nearest to Victoria's had developed an acute awareness of her presence. Conversations grew quieter. Silverware touched plates more gently. Victoria picked up her fork and cut into the salmon. The knife went through cleanly. The fish cooked to the exact temperature she preferred. She took a bite, chewed slowly, and set her fork down with a deliberateness that made Ethan's shoulders tighten. "This is overcooked," she said. Ethan looked at the salmon. It wasn't overcooked. He'd watched Carlos plate it himself, had seen the perfect pale pink interior when the fish was cut, but he kept his expression neutral. "I apologize, Miss Hale. I'll have the kitchen prepare a new one immediately." "Don't apologize," Victoria said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Fix it." Ethan reached for the plate, but Victoria's hand shot out and stopped him, her fingers not quite touching his wrist, but close enough to establish a boundary. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd approached her table, her full attention was focused on him. It felt like standing under a heat lamp. "How long have you worked here?" she asked. 2 years, Ms. Hale." 2 years, and you still can't tell when fish is overcooked?" Ethan met her gaze. Her eyes were dark, unblinking, the eyes of someone who'd spent decades learning how to read people for weaknesses. He recognized the tactic because he'd seen it before, in landlords who wanted extra rent, in school administrators who questioned his custody arrangements, in bosses who believed single fathers couldn't be reliable employees. "I'll speak to the chef personally," Ethan said, keeping his voice level. "We'll have a replacement out in 5 minutes." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing over her chest. The gesture looked casual, but there was nothing casual about the way she was studying him. "You don't seem particularly concerned." "I'm very concerned about your experience, Ms. Hale. That's why I want to correct this immediately." "Your tone suggests otherwise." Ethan felt the conversation shifting into dangerous territory. He'd navigated situations like this before, moments where someone with power decided to test how much they could push. The correct response was usually deference, apology, submission. But something in Victoria's expression told him that she'd seen 1,000 people bow their heads, and it hadn't satisfied whatever she was looking for. "I apologize if my tone seemed inappropriate," Ethan said. "That wasn't my intention." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. She uncrossed her arms and placed her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd used earlier when testing its stability. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, Ms. Hale. You're a regular customer." "We value your business." "That's not what I asked." Ethan knew exactly what she was asking. She wanted acknowledgement of her power, her influence, the fact that she could make a phone call and end not just his job, but his prospects for employment anywhere in the city's service industry. He'd heard stories about Victoria Hale from other servers, tales of careers destroyed over minor infractions, of managers fired for not meeting her unstated expectations. "I know you're an important client," Ethan said carefully. "I want to make sure your meal meets your standards." Victoria picked up her water glass and took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his face. When she set it down, her expression had shifted into something that looked almost like curiosity. "You're being very diplomatic." "I'm trying to do my job, Ms. Hale." "Your job is to serve me. Right now, you're failing at it." The words landed like a slap, designed to provoke a reaction. Ethan felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he got when his daughter's school called with another problem he'd have to solve on his lunch break, when the landlord raised the rent again, when the universe reminded him that he was always one mistake away from catastrophe. But he'd learned a long time ago that reacting only made things worse. "I understand your frustration," Ethan said. "Let me get that corrected for you." He reached for the plate again. This time, Victoria didn't stop him, but she spoke before he could lift it. "Where's the manager?" Ethan's hand hovered over the plate. "I can get him for you if you'd like." "I'd like." Ethan straightened and walked toward the kitchen, feeling Victoria's eyes on his back. He found Robert near the expediting station, reviewing tickets with the kind of frantic energy that suggested he was already aware something had gone wrong. When Robert saw Ethan's expression, his face went pale. "She wants to speak to you," Ethan said quietly. Robert's hand went to his tie, adjusting it in a nervous gesture that had become reflexive. "What happened?" "The salmon's overcooked, or she says it is." "Is it?" "No." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. Then he smoothed his jacket, fixed his expression into something professionally neutral, and walked out into the dining room. Ethan followed at a respectful distance, already knowing how this conversation would go. Victoria was waiting with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and knew everyone else was on a clock. Robert approached her table with the posture of a man walking to his own execution, and he smiled with the desperate warmth of someone trying to defuse a bomb. "Ms. Hale, I understand there's been an issue with your meal," Robert said. His voice had the practiced smoothness of years in hospitality, but there was a tremor underneath it that only someone listening carefully would catch. "Your server brought me overcooked fish," Victoria said. "I want to know if this is the standard I should expect from an establishment of this caliber." Robert's smile tightened. "Of course not, Ms. Hale. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I apologize for the inconvenience. We'll have a new dish prepared immediately, and naturally, your meal today is complimentary." "I don't want a complimentary meal," Victoria said. "I want competence. I want staff who understand the difference between acceptable service and negligence." The word negligence hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Robert's hand went to his tie again. "I assure you, we take your experience very seriously. Ethan is one of our most reliable servers, but if there's been a lapse in judgment, don't make excuses for him," Victoria interrupted. She glanced at Ethan, who was standing a few feet behind Robert, and her expression shifted into something colder. "He's a grown man. He should be able to take responsibility for his own failures." Ethan felt the heat rising in his chest, not from anger, but from the recognition of what was happening. This wasn't about the fish. It had never been about the fish. This was about power, about someone who'd built an empire by making people feel small, and who needed that feeling confirmed over and over again. Robert turned slightly, looking at Ethan with an expression that was part apology, part warning. "Ethan, do you have anything you'd like to say to Ms. Hale?" It was a trap. The correct answer was an apology, a promise to do better, a demonstration of the proper hierarchy. Ethan knew that. He also knew that whatever he said right now would be dissected, analyzed, used as evidence of either submission or insubordination. There was no winning move, only degrees of losing. But then he thought about his daughter, Emma, who was probably in math class right now, learning about fractions or percentages, or whatever they taught in 4th grade. He thought about the conversation they'd had last week when she'd come home crying because a classmate had said something cruel about her not having a mother. He'd told her that some people hurt others because it makes them feel powerful, and that the strongest thing you can do is refuse to let them take your dignity. He looked at Victoria Hale, and he spoke with the same calm he'd used when talking to Emma. "I'll take responsibility for my part in this, Ms. Hale. The fish was cooked to standard specifications, but if it didn't meet your expectations, that's a failure on my part to understand what you were looking for. I apologize for that, but I won't apologize for things I didn't do." The dining room seemed to contract. Conversations at nearby tables stopped mid-sentence. Robert's face went through several shades of pale. Victoria's expression froze, her eyes locked on Ethan with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "Excuse me?" Victoria's voice was soft, dangerous. "I'm saying I'll take responsibility for what's mine to own," Ethan continued, "but I won't claim fault for things that aren't my fault. The fish wasn't overcooked. You didn't like it, and that's valid. And I should have caught that earlier. That's on me. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'm incompetent when I'm not." Robert looked like he was going to have a stroke. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Ms. Hale, I apologize. This is completely inappropriate, and I assure you—" "Stop," Victoria said, cutting him off without looking away from Ethan. Robert froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Victoria stood up. She was shorter than Ethan had expected, maybe 5'6", but she carried herself with the kind of presence that made height irrelevant. She picked up her purse, a leather bag that probably cost more than Ethan made in 6 months, and adjusted the strap over her shoulder. "You think you're being brave," she said to Ethan, her voice cold and precise. "You think standing up to me makes you noble. But all you've done is prove that you don't understand how the world works." Ethan didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. Victoria turned to Robert, and her expression shifted into something that looked almost sympathetic. "I've been coming to this restaurant for 5 years. In that time, I've never once questioned your judgment about staffing. But if this is the caliber of employee you're hiring now, I may need to reconsider my patronage." Robert's face had gone from pale to gray. "Ms. Hale, please, let me—" "I'm not interested in your explanations," Victoria said. She pulled her phone from her purse and tapped the screen a few times. "I'll be speaking to the building's ownership about standards and expectations. I suggest you do the same with your staff." She walked toward the exit without another word. The hostess scrambled to open the door, nearly tripping over her own feet in the process. Victoria passed through it without acknowledgement, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence she'd left behind. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Robert turned to Ethan, and his expression was no longer worried. It was furious. The kind of anger that comes from fear that's been given permission to transform into rage. "My office," Robert said. His voice was shaking. "Now." Ethan followed him through the dining room, past the other servers who wouldn't meet his eyes, through the kitchen where Carlos stopped mid-chop to watch them pass, and into the small office at the back that smelled like old coffee and financial desperation. Robert closed the door behind them and stood there for a moment, his hand still on the knob, his back to Ethan. When he finally turned around, his face was red. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I was being honest," Ethan said. "Honest?" Robert's voice cracked on the word. "That woman can destroy this restaurant with a phone call. Do you understand that? Not just your job. Mine. Everyone's. She owns half the buildings in this district. Her investment firm controls more money than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. And you decided this was the moment to be honest?" Ethan didn't have a good answer for that. He'd known the risks when he'd spoken. He'd known that telling the truth, even a small truth, could cost him everything. But he'd also known that bowing his head one more time, apologizing for something he hadn't done, would cost him something else that was harder to name but just as important. "I have a daughter," Ethan said quietly. "I can't teach her to stand up for herself if I don't do the same." Robert stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. Then he shook his head, the anger draining out of him and leaving something sadder behind. "That's very noble, Ethan. I hope it's worth it when you're explaining to your daughter why you can't pay rent this month." Robert sent Ethan home early. Not fired, not suspended. Just sent home with instructions to come back tomorrow and await further word about his employment status. Ethan walked out through the kitchen, collected his jacket from the staff locker room, and pushed through the service exit into the alley behind the restaurant. The afternoon sun hit him like a physical thing, bright and indifferent. He stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, trying to calculate how long his savings would last if Robert decided to let him go. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if he was careful. Emma's school had already sent 2 reminders about overdue lunch account payments. The car needed an oil change he'd been putting off for 2 months. His phone bill was due next week. The math didn't work. It never worked. But he'd gotten used to that, to the constant balancing act of stretching too little money across too many needs. What he hadn't gotten used to was the feeling in his chest right now, something that sat between regret and satisfaction and refused to resolve into either one cleanly. He pulled out his phone and texted his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who picked Emma up from school on days when his shift ran long. "Got off early today. I'll get Emma myself." "Thanks." Mrs. Patterson responded within seconds with a thumbs-up emoji. She was 73 and had learned to text from her grandchildren. Ethan had helped her set up her phone 2 years ago, and she'd been helping him with childcare ever since, refusing payment, but accepting the occasional casserole he'd learned to make from YouTube videos. The walk to Emma's school took 20 minutes. Ethan used the time to rehearse what he'd tell her if he lost his job. She was 9, old enough to understand that money was tight, but young enough to believe her father when he said everything would be okay. He hated lying to her, but he also knew that some truths were too heavy for children to carry. The school let out at 3:15. Ethan arrived at 3, joining the cluster of parents and nannies waiting outside the main entrance. Most of them he recognized by sight, if not by name, part of the rotating cast of adults who formed the support structure of elementary school life. A few nodded at him. Most were absorbed in their phones. When the doors opened and children began streaming out, Ethan spotted Emma immediately. She had his dark hair and her mother's eyes, though he tried not to think about that too much. She was wearing the purple backpack he'd bought her at a thrift store, the one with a patch she'd sewn on herself that said, "Science Rules," in uneven letters. She saw him, and her face lit up with surprise. "Dad? You're early." "Finished work sooner than I thought," Ethan said, which was technically true. "How was school?" Emma launched into a detailed description of a science experiment involving vinegar and baking soda, her hands gesturing wildly as she explained the chemical reaction. Ethan listened, asked questions, let her enthusiasm wash over him like a reminder of why he did any of this. They walked home together, Emma's hand in his, her voice filling the space between them with stories about her teacher and her friends, and the book she was reading about space exploration. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been old when Ethan moved in and hadn't improved with age. The hallway smelled like cooking oil and carpet cleaner. Their unit was small, 2 bedrooms barely bigger than closets, a kitchen with appliances from the 1980s, a living room where the couch doubled as Ethan's bed most nights because Emma needed her own space more than he did. Emma dropped her backpack by the door and went straight to the kitchen table to start her homework. Ethan made her a snack, apple slices with peanut butter, and sat across from her while she worked through math problems. He helped when she asked, mostly with word problems that required translating English into numbers, and tried not to think about what he'd say to her if Robert called tonight with bad news. His phone rang at 6:30. Emma was in her room, reading before bed. Ethan looked at the screen and saw Robert's name. He let it ring twice before answering, his hand steady even though his heart wasn't. "Hello," Ethan said. Robert's voice came through tinny and strained. "Ethan, I need you to come in early tomorrow, 8 o'clock, before the restaurant opens." "Am I still employed?" Ethan asked, cutting through whatever preamble Robert had planned. There was a long stretch of silence on the other end. Then Robert sighed, and it sounded like air leaking from a tire. "Just be here at 8, please." The line went dead. Ethan set his phone down and stared at it, trying to decode what that conversation meant. Robert hadn't fired him, but he hadn't not fired him either. The ambiguity felt worse than either outcome, a space where anxiety could grow unchecked. He didn't sleep well that night. He kept running through scenarios, imagining conversations, preparing arguments he'd never get to make. By the time his alarm went off at 6:30, he'd been awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling and listening to the building's pipes groan through their morning routine. Emma was still asleep when he left. He wrote her a note, reminded her that Mrs. Patterson would walk her to school, told her he loved her. Then he caught the bus downtown, watching the city wake up through dirty windows, and tried to prepare himself for whatever was waiting at Meridian. The restaurant was dark when he arrived. The front door was locked, but the service entrance was open. Ethan let himself in and found Robert in the dining room, standing by table 12 with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. The morning light coming through the windows cast long shadows across the empty tables, and the whole space felt like a stage waiting for actors. "Thanks for coming," Robert said. He gestured to a chair. "Sit." Ethan sat, though everything in his posture suggested he was ready to stand back up at a moment's notice. Robert remained standing, his hands moving from his arms to his pockets and back again, unable to find a comfortable position. "Victoria Hale came back this morning," Robert said. "Before we opened, she asked to speak to me personally." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Okay." "She wanted to know if I'd fired you yet," Robert continued. "She seemed to think it was a foregone conclusion. When I told her I hadn't made a decision, she asked why not. She said you'd been insubordinate, unprofessional, and that keeping you employed would reflect poorly on the establishment." Ethan nodded slowly. This was going exactly where he'd expected. "And you agreed with her?" "I told her I'd take her feedback under advisement," Robert said, "and then she did something I've never seen her do in 5 years of dealing with her." Robert pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down heavily, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep, tired in the way of someone who'd spent years bending to pressure and had just watched someone else refuse to bend. "She apologized," Robert said quietly. Ethan blinked. "What? Not to me?" "She said she wanted to apologize to you. She's coming back at 9. She asked if you'd be willing to hear her out." The words didn't make sense in the order Robert had arranged them. Ethan tried to process them individually, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit the box they'd come in. Victoria Hale didn't apologize. That wasn't how power worked. Power didn't apologize. It didn't need to. "I don't understand," Ethan said. Robert shook his head. "Neither do I. But she was very specific. She said she'd been thinking about your conversation yesterday, and that she realized something she needed to say to you directly. She asked me not to fire you. She said it would be a mistake." "She said that?" "Those exact words." Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to find an angle that made this make sense. "Is this some kind of trap? Is she going to come in and humiliate me in person?" "I don't know," Robert admitted. "I've known Victoria Hale for 5 years, and I've never seen her behave like this. She seemed different, quieter, less certain." At 9 o'clock exactly, the front door opened, and Victoria Hale walked in. She was wearing a different suit, navy instead of gray, and she carried a leather folder under her arm. She looked around the empty dining room until she spotted Ethan and Robert sitting at table 12, and then she walked toward them with steps that seemed slower than yesterday, less certain of their destination. Robert stood up immediately. Ethan stood a beat later, his body responding to ingrained professional habit before his mind caught up. Victoria stopped a few feet from the table and looked at Ethan directly. Her expression was hard to read, something between discomfort and determination. "Mr. Cole," she said, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "I didn't know I had a choice," Ethan replied. Something flickered across Victoria's face that might have been the ghost of a smile. "That's fair. May I sit?" Robert pulled out a chair, and Victoria sat down with the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms learning that how you held your body could be as important as what you said. Ethan sat across from her. Robert remained standing, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Victoria set the leather folder on the table but didn't open it. Instead, She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Ethan with an expression that was trying very hard to be something other than what it usually was. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words came out stiff, unpracticed, like a language she'd learned from a book but never spoken aloud. "My behavior yesterday was inexcusable. I treated you with disrespect because I could, because I'm used to people accepting that treatment, and because it's easier to make others feel small than to examine why I feel the need to do it." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't tell if this was genuine or performance, and he wasn't sure it mattered. Victoria continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "I've spent 30 years building a career on being the person people are afraid to disappoint," she said. "It's effective. It's profitable. But last night, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about taking responsibility for your part, but not apologizing for things you didn't do. It was such a simple distinction. But it made me realize I've been demanding apologies from people for years, without considering whether they actually owed them." She opened the folder and pulled out a check. She slid it across the table toward Ethan. He glanced down and saw an amount that made his breath catch. $5,000. "This isn't charity," Victoria said quickly, "and it's not hush money. Consider it an acknowledgement that I wasted your time, created unnecessary stress, and put your employment at risk because I was having a bad day and you were convenient. You don't have to accept it. But I wanted you to know that I understand there are consequences to my behavior, even if I've spent most of my life insulated from them." Ethan looked at the check, then at Victoria, then back at the check. $5,000 would solve problems he'd been juggling for months. It would pay down debt, cover Emma's school expenses, give him a buffer against the next crisis. But taking it felt like accepting something he couldn't name, some acknowledgement of a power dynamic he'd spent yesterday refusing to validate. "Why are you really doing this?" Ethan asked. Victoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That dignity isn't something people earn through status or wealth. It's something everyone has by default, and taking it away from them says more about me than it does about them. I don't know if I can change who I've become, but I can at least acknowledge when I've been wrong." Ethan picked up the check. He looked at it for a long time, thinking about Emma's school account, about the car that needed maintenance, about the rent that was always due. Then he set it back down on the table and slid it toward Victoria. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, "but I can't accept this. Not because I don't need it. I do. But because if I take it, then what happened yesterday becomes a transaction, and I need it to stay what it was, which was me doing my job with dignity and you learning something from that. Money changes what that means." Victoria stared at the check, then at Ethan. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely surprised. "You're refusing $5,000 on principle?" "I'm refusing it because some things matter more than money," Ethan said. "And I need to be able to tell my daughter that I stood up for what was right even when it was expensive." Victoria picked up the check and folded it carefully, sliding it back into the folder. She stood up, and Robert straightened immediately, ready to escort her out. But she didn't move toward the door. Instead, she extended her hand to Ethan. "Thank you," she said, "for yesterday and for today." Ethan shook her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, the handshake of someone who'd sealed countless deals. But there was something different in it now, some acknowledgement of equality that hadn't been there before. Victoria left without another word. Robert watched her go, then turned to Ethan with an expression that suggested he'd just witnessed something he'd need years to process. "You just turned down $5,000. "I did," Ethan confirmed. "Are you insane?" Ethan thought about it. "Maybe. But I'll be able to sleep tonight." Robert shook his head slowly, somewhere between disbelief and admiration. You still have a job, in case that wasn't clear, and I'm giving you table 12 permanently. Mark can have a different section. I appreciate that, Ethan said. He stood up, straightened his shirt, and checked the time. I should get ready for lunch service. The restaurant opened at 11. By 11:30, the dining room was filling up with the usual lunch crowd, executives and lawyers, and people who could afford to spend $40 on a salad. Ethan moved through the space with the same careful efficiency he'd always had, taking orders, delivering food, managing the small crises that defined restaurant work. At noon, a woman sat down at table 12. She was in her 30s, wearing a business suit that suggested she worked somewhere in the building. She ordered the salmon, no butter, steamed vegetables, no seasoning. Ethan wrote it down, brought her water, made sure everything was to her satisfaction. The salmon arrived perfectly cooked. The woman ate without complaint. When she finished, she left a 20% tip and walked out. It was ordinary, unremarkable, exactly the kind of service Ethan had been providing for 2 years. But something had changed. He couldn't name it exactly, couldn't point to a specific difference in how he moved through the dining room or how he interacted with customers. But he felt it, a subtle shift in how he held himself, in the knowledge that he'd been tested and hadn't broken. At 3 o'clock, his shift ended. He changed out of his work clothes, collected his jacket, and walked out into the afternoon sun. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mrs. Patterson says I can have cookies. Can I?" Ethan smiled and typed back, "Yes, but only 2, and then save me 1. He walked to the bus stop, joined the line of people waiting to go home, and thought about dignity and power and the difference between the two. Victoria Hale had built an empire on making people afraid, but fear, Ethan had learned, was just another kind of weakness. And the strongest thing you could do was refuse to let someone else's weakness become your own. The bus arrived. Ethan got on, found a seat, and watched the city pass by outside the window. Somewhere in that city, Victoria Hale was probably in a meeting, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. And somewhere else, Emma was eating cookies and doing homework and waiting for her father to come home. Both things were true. Both things mattered. And Ethan had learned that the real measure of a person wasn't how much power they had, but how they chose to use it when nobody was watching. Or in his case, how they chose not to surrender it when everyone was.